I was at my friend's house that Saturday afternoon, pretending I had some errand to run but really just wanting to be somewhere that wasn't my tiny apartment. The house smelled faintly of old wood and fresh coffee, a mix that somehow made me feel like the world was softer here. I had just set my backpack down in the corner when I heard the front door click, and she was there, his mom, Julia. I'd met her a few times before. Always polished, always calm, with a presence that made the air feel thicker somehow. But today, standing there in a loose sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back messily, she felt different, easier, dangerous, in a quiet, unspoken way. "Good," she said, almost to herself, a slow smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "He's not here?" I froze for a second, my heart probably betraying me more than I wanted. The way she said it, like a secret meant only for me to hear, made the air between us feel charged. And then she added, almost whispering, "Now we can play." I don't even know what I expected, what I wanted, but the words hung there like smoke. She didn't move closer. She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. Every subtle flicker of her gaze, the way she let her eyes linger on me for a fraction too long, made it impossible to act like this was ordinary. I made some excuse about needing a drink from the kitchen. My hands shook slightly when I picked up the cup, even though it was just water. She was behind me, leaning casually against the doorway, watching. "You've been spending a lot of time here lately," she said, tilting her head, that smirk still there. "Not that I'm complaining." I laughed nervously, aware that it sounded too loud in the quiet room. My eyes found hers again, and there it was. A glance that lingered just long enough to make me imagine things I didn't want to admit to anyone, least of all myself. We didn't talk much after that. She disappeared to check on something upstairs, and I stayed where I was, pretending to scroll through my phone. But every creak of the floorboards, every soft thump of her steps, kept me on edge. Something unspoken was hovering between us, fragile and electric, like it could ignite if either of us dared to name it. Later, when I finally left, I felt that subtle pull again, the one that made it hard to walk away, even though I knew nothing had happened. I kept replaying the smirk, the half-whispered words, the way her eyes had held mine just a second too long. That night, I kept replaying her voice in my head, like I missed something, or maybe wanted something. I found myself back at Julia's house a few days later, under the pretense of helping fix a leak in the guest bathroom. The truth was, I wasn't sure why I kept coming, except that there was something about the way she moved through her space that made the air feel heavier and lighter at the same time. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. For a moment, she didn't even look up. Then, finally, she did, and her expression shifted. Something between acknowledgement and curiosity, but careful, guarded. "Thought you'd be busy today," she said. Her voice was calm, almost detached, but there was an undercurrent there I couldn't place. I had some free time," I said, trying not to sound like I was inventing excuses as I spoke. My eyes drifted to her hands. They were strong, elegant in a quiet way, and the way she held the mug, fingers tightening briefly, made me notice the subtle tremor in her wrist. Tired, maybe, or nervous. She didn't invite me to sit, but I did anyway, perching on the edge of a chair while she leaned against the counter. I watched her, careful not to stare too long, but there was no way to avoid it. Every slight movement, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the tiny sigh as she set the mug down, felt like a private signal meant for me alone. "So," she said finally, glancing at me, "you're really committed to fixing that bathroom, huh?" I nodded, fumbling with the wrench. "Yeah. Thought I'd help." My voice sounded small even to me. Her gaze softened for just a moment, and then she looked away, stirring her coffee. That's when I noticed how tired she looked, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged slightly, the pause before she spoke again. Something about that hesitation, that careful distance, pulled at me more than anything else. She laughed suddenly at something on her phone, a quick, almost accidental sound that filled the kitchen in a way that made my chest tighten. I wanted to tell her how every laugh, every small detail, stuck in my mind. But I didn't. I just watched. She looked at me again, like she wanted to say something, but didn't, and that silence felt louder than words. We stood there, in the quiet of the kitchen, the air thick between us. I wanted to step closer to ask what she hadn't said. I wanted to reach out and brush my fingers against hers, but something unspoken, some invisible boundary, kept me still. When I finally left, I walked to the door slowly, aware of the lingering energy, of the way her presence had settled into my chest like a small, persistent weight. I didn't need her to speak. I didn't need clarity. Just the way she looked at me, just that small crack of vulnerability I'd glimpsed, was enough to keep me thinking, imagining, wanting. She didn't say anything as I left. She didn't have to. And yet, I could feel her attention following me out into the sunlight, leaving me with a quiet ache I couldn't name. That evening, I ended up back at Julia's house again. This time, it was under the guise of helping her move some boxes from the garage into the living room. Rain had started earlier, drumming softly against the windows, and the air smelled like wet earth and old timber. Somehow, the storm made everything feel more intimate, more urgent. We worked in silence for the first few minutes, our movements careful, deliberate. I carried a box too close to the edge, and she reached out, fingers brushing mine as she steadied it. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, but my skin hummed where it happened. She didn't look at me, just adjusted the box and muttered something about needing more light. I followed her to the living room, carrying another box, and noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders. She was always so composed, but tonight she seemed smaller, like the weight of some unseen burden pressed on her. "You don't have to do all this," she said finally, her voice low. "I can manage." I shrugged, pretending casualness, though my pulse betrayed me. "I don't mind." For a long moment, we paused near the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The soft patter made the silence feel thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the urge to say something, to break it, but every word I thought of sounded wrong. Her phone buzzed on the side table, and she glanced at it, a brief frown crossing her face. Some ex, maybe, or a friend. Whoever it was, it pulled her out of the moment, and the spell broke. I wanted to ask who it was, wanted to hold her hand as if to make her forget, but I didn't. I only watched the way her fingers hovered over the screen before putting the phone down again. Later, I sat on the edge of the couch, pretending to check the contents of the box. She sat across from me, a few feet away, sipping coffee she'd made. Our legs brushed under the small table. I felt it, the electricity of that near touch, the impossibility of saying what was stirring between us. I should go soon," I said, more to break the tension than out of obligation. She looked up, eyes meeting mine for longer than they should have. "You should go now," she said softly, almost reluctantly, a subtle tremor in her tone. My hand was halfway to hers when she said it, and I did, but only my body left that room. I walked to my car in silence, the rain soaking my hair, my mind spinning. I couldn't stop thinking about the brush of her fingers, the weight of her gaze, the almost things that had almost happened. Nothing had happened, and yet, it felt like everything had shifted. I kept replaying that near moment in my head. The way the rain had blurred the edges of the world, the way her presence had filled the room like smoke, like sunlight. And I knew, even then, that the line we weren't supposed to cross had been drawn. But I was dangerously close to wanting to step over it. It had been a few nights since the rainstorm, and I found myself sitting in Julia's living room again, this time under the pretense of helping her organize old photographs. The house was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock filling the gaps where conversation didn't exist. She was across from me, sorting through a stack of pictures with a careful, methodical air, but I could see her hands trembling ever so slightly when she lifted the next one. Something was in the air tonight. An unspoken pressure, thick and unrelenting, cleared my throat. "Do you ever feel like things are different than they should be?" My words stumbled over themselves. I didn't even know what I was asking, but I needed to say something. She didn't look up. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she ran a hand through her hair, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to weigh every thought before it emerged. The silence between us stretched, long and heavy, like it was holding its own breath. I don't know, she finally said, her voice soft, almost breaking, though she tried to hide it. Maybe we're pretending things are normal when they're not. My chest tightened. I wanted to speak, to explain myself, to bridge the gap, but I knew words wouldn't do. They had never done enough. So I just looked at her, really looked, at the curve of her jaw, the way her lips pressed together, the faint shadows under her eyes. She glanced at me then, and for the first time I thought I saw something raw, unfiltered, a vulnerability she didn't usually allow anyone to see. And yet, even in that vulnerability, there was restraint. A careful line she wouldn't cross, a distance she maintained even as our worlds collided in the quiet of her living room. We sat like that for what felt like hours, not speaking, just letting the weight of each other's presence fill the room. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the gap with some tangible proof that I understood, that I cared, that I was here. But I didn't. I stayed still, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile honesty between us. Finally, she set down the stack of photographs, leaned back in her chair, and let out a soft sigh. I don't know what we're doing, she whispered. I don't know if this, whatever this is, should even exist. I didn't answer. I just let her words hang in the air, heavy and sharp, knowing that silence could carry more weight than any confession I might offer. She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. I could feel the truth in the room, a quiet, aching understanding that neither of us was ready to name. And even though nothing had happened yet, I felt it, the shift, the tension, the raw possibility of something we weren't allowed to pursue. She didn't say anything, just looked at me, like she was already mourning something we never even had. A week later, I found myself helping Julia sort through some old boxes in the attic. Dust motes floated in the thin beams of sunlight coming through the small windows, and the smell of old paper and wood made the space feel suspended in time. The quiet between us had grown heavier lately, full of things we weren't saying, things that hovered in every glance. As I handed her a box labeled Memories, she paused and opened it. Inside was a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, photographs yellowed with age, and a small, cracked music box. She hesitated, fingers brushing over the ribbon, lingering longer than necessary. I haven't looked at these in years, she said, voice tight. Since him. Her words caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. I only nodded, letting her carry the weight of the memory alone, but wanting somehow to bridge the space between us. She opened a letter carefully, unfolding it as if it might tear. Her eyes softened, glimmering with a mix of pain and nostalgia. I could see it in her hands, how they trembled ever so slightly, how she clutched the paper as if it were both fragile and sacred. I loved him, she whispered, almost to herself. And I lost him. Somehow I lost myself too. I swallowed hard, aware of the ache that ran through my chest. Not just for her, not just for the story she carried, but because this was the first time she had let me see the pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. Vulnerable, unguarded, and human. I wanted to say something comforting, something meaningful, but no words felt right. Instead, I set down the box I was holding and just watched her, noting the way her lips quivered, the slight slump of her shoulders, the deep inhale she didn't seem to realize she was taking. For a long moment we just stayed there, two people surrounded by relics of a past neither of us could touch. And then, slowly, she looked up at me, not with fear, not with caution, but with a quiet, fragile openness that made my chest tighten. She took a breath like she hadn't allowed herself to in years, and for the first time, she looked at me without fear. I felt something shift in that instant, a fragile, trembling bridge forming between us. Not love, not yet, not fully, but something unavoidable, something real. I wanted to reach out, to let her know I saw her completely, but I stayed still. She had chosen this moment to reveal a corner of herself, and I would not rush it. I simply let the silence hold us, letting the emotional weight settle naturally, letting the air between us carry its quiet confession. And as we descended the attic stairs together, her hand brushed mine briefly. So brief, so fleeting. But it carried the resonance of trust, of understanding, of something unspoken that neither of us could name. Why yet it was a Sunday evening, and the house felt softer somehow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Julia and I were in the living room, just sitting together. Not talking much, not needing to. I was folding laundry she had set aside, and she was perched on the couch, a blanket loosely draped over her legs. The air between us had changed since the attic. There was no need for confessions, no need for declarations. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something steadier, warmer. An acknowledgement that neither of us could ignore what had grown quietly over weeks, over glances, over touches that lingered too long. She reached for the blanket and tugged it closer, and our hands brushed. Again, the briefest contact. But this time it didn't ignite anxiety. It settled, like a gentle acknowledgement. "You're quiet tonight," she said, voice soft, almost teasing. I'm just here," I said, fumbling with the laundry, not wanting to admit that being here with her, like this, made everything else fade. Her eyes met mine, steady and calm, and she let out a small sigh. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured. Not an apology, not a confession, just a quiet admission. And somehow that was enough. I put the laundry aside and sat on the edge of the couch, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. We didn't speak. There was no need. The room was quiet except for the hum of the heater and the soft, rhythmic sound of our breathing. Slowly, I reached out and rested my hand lightly over hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted slightly, letting our fingers intertwine naturally, without force or pretense. It felt earned, a connection grown from weeks of silence, hesitation, and stolen moments. For a long while, we just sat like that, hands together, shoulders almost touching, the world outside ceasing to matter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. It was the quiet collapse into something neither of us had expected but both had slowly built. She didn't say she loved me, and I didn't either. But in that shared space, in the small, subtle ways, her hand on mine, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale as she relaxed into the couch, I knew we had crossed a line we hadn't even realized we were approaching. Everything that had been unspoken, every glance, every tremor of hesitation, every near moment, felt compressed into that one quiet hour. And it was enough. She didn't say she loved me, but she let her guard down, and that was louder than any "I love you" ever could be. Weeks had passed since that Sunday evening, yet the memory of it stayed with me like a quiet hum beneath everything I did. I found myself thinking about Julia more often than I thought I should, not in a reckless, impulsive way, but with a steady, persistent awareness. She had become part of my rhythm, part of my silence, part of the spaces in between words where meaning often hid. I walked past her house the other day, watching the curtains flutter in the breeze, and remembered the soft brush of her fingers against mine. That small gesture had changed something fundamental, and it wasn't just about desire. It was about trust, about recognition, about the slow accumulation of moments that revealed who we really were to each other. I realized that what we had wasn't dramatic or obvious. It wasn't loud declarations or cinematic gestures. It was the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence, the way we had learned to read the subtle shifts in posture, the almost imperceptible changes in tone. It was the way she could walk into a room and make me feel simultaneously at ease and utterly aware of her. And I learned something too, about patience, about holding space for someone without demanding anything, about how intimacy didn't always need words. The way she looked at me sometimes, like she wanted to speak but couldn't yet, taught me that some connections were earned slowly, carefully, without shortcuts. I thought about all the near moments, the unspoken confessions, the touches that hovered just at the edge of action. Each one had built into a quiet understanding that neither of us had forced, but that had grown inevitably, like sunlight through cracks in a wall. Now, sitting alone in my apartment, I smile quietly at the thought of her. Not because I possess her, or because there's a dramatic end to the story, but because we had discovered something rare and real. Something that didn't need labels or explanations. Something that simply was. I didn't just fall for an older woman. I fell into something rare, something true. And I hope, if you're listening, you find something like that too. There's no grand finale. No fireworks, no sweeping statements. Just the understanding that some connections, some people, touch you in ways that stay long after the words fade. That's what she did to me. That's what she always will. And somewhere in that quiet knowledge, I found a kind of peace, a kind of joy. Not the kind that shouts. Not the kind that demands attention. But the kind that lingers, that resonates, that reminds you that life sometimes offers something subtle, unassuming, and utterly unforgettable. If the story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?